Over the last 30 years, somewhere around 1,600 to 4,000 Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people have gone missing and murdered in Canada. Here are the faces of 307 of them. To understand why Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people are a target of these crimes, we have to look back to when colonialism first started. Canada was colonized in the early 1600s. The buffalo was the main source of food and clothing for Indigenous people in North America. The colonizers saw this, and they hunted nearly all the buffalo. When smallpox broke out in the 1700s, it was hard to find food to stay healthy. Indigenous people had never experienced disease before European contact. Disease had killed around 70% of Indigenous people in North America. One of the reasons the disease spread so vigorously was because the colonizers gave Indigenous people smallpox-infected blankets. Germ warfare was conspired by Jeffrey Amherst and Colonel Henry Bouquet in 1763. They sent postscripts back and forth discussing the matter. On July 13, 1763, Colonel Henry Bouquet wrote, P.S. I will try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets that may fall into their hands, taking care, however, to not get the disease myself. As it is a pity to oppose good men against them, I wish we could make use of the Spaniards' method and hunt them with English dogs, supported by rangers and some light horse who I think would efficiently extirpate or remove that vermin. Amherst wrote back on July 16th, P.S. You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race. I should be very glad your scheme for hunting them with dogs could take effect, but England is at too great a distance to think of that at the present. On July 26, Bouquet wrote back, I received yesterday your Excellency's letters of the 16th with your enclosures. The signal for Indian messengers and all your directions will be observed.
The buffalo always sustained us. The newcomers saw this. When they started killing them off, we started to die from hunger. Our leaders realized we had to find a new way to live. They came together at Fort Carleton and Fort Pitt in 1876 to meet the Crown's representatives. They negotiated our future through Treaty 6, a nation-to-nation agreement. Our people were told that the newly arrived Northwest Mounted Police were there to protect us. Livelihood, education, health care, hunting rights, and more were all promised in exchange for sharing the land to the depth of a plow.
In an Al Jazeera article titled Canada and the First Nations, A History of Broken Promises, Carl Quinn talks about the understanding between the Indigenous people and the Europeans. The numbered treaties were established in 1763, and this was just the beginning for Europeans trying to strip Indigenous people of their culture. After promising shared resources and land, the colonizers forced Indigenous people onto reserves and made a bunch of oppressive laws called the Indian Act.
Vast native territories that we managed according to our own governance systems were reduced to a tiny patchwork of reserves. Today, Indian reserves account for just 0.2% of the land.
The Indian Act first came to power on April 12, 1876. In 1876, the government determined who qualifies as Indian. If you were an Indian male, if you were a child of an Indian male, or if you were married to an Indian male. Those who qualified were given Indian status. status was not guaranteed for women. The legislation stated that a status Indian woman who married a non-Indian man would then cease to be Indian. If a woman lost her status, she would lose treaty benefits, health benefits, the right to live on the reserve, the right to inherit family property, right to be buried on the reserve with her ancestors. But if a man married a woman who was non-Indigenous, he would still get to keep all of his rights. Indigenous people were the only ones allowed on reserves, and they couldn't leave unless they had a permission slip. It was illegal for anyone who was of status Indian to hire a lawyer. This was in place until 1951. Women were denied the right to possess land and material property. Only widows could possess land under the reserve system. However, a widow could not inherit her husband's personal property upon his death. Everything, including the family house, legally went to his children. Government agents slightly modified this in 1884. Men were allowed to will their estate to their wives if the wife was deemed of good moral character by an Indian agent. This remained until 1951. They were controlling female sexuality in many ways. In 1884, the potlatch was banned, and in 1895, any Indian festival, dance, or other ceremony, which would include powwows and the sun dance, were also banned. The exception to this was Indian Days from 1910 to 1972. One day a year where a festival was set up to encourage tourism. Indigenous people were encouraged to dress up and entertain tourists. There was a loss of cultural, spiritual, and ceremonial knowledge that had been developed over thousands of years and passed down through generations. Until 1951, Indigenous women were excluded from political activity by law. They weren't allowed to vote or hold office. With the Indian Act, all Indigenous children were forced to go to residential schools. It was illegal for them to attend any other educational institution. Legal guardianship over Indigenous children was transferred over to residential school principals. The first residential school opened in 1831, and the last residential school to close was in 1996. Over 1,500,000 children attended residential schools between these times. The residential schools were a form of genocide. In a book by Celia Haig Brown called Resistance and Renewal: Surviving the Indian Residential School, Randy Fred talks about the boots they made them wear that were designed to prevent them from running away. Some of the survivors from the Cooper Island Residential School call it Alcatraz. The school was surrounded by a body of water, and some of the kids tried to swim away in order to escape. Almost all of the time they were tracked down and brought back. Kevin Annett explains this in his independent inquiry called Hidden from History: The Canadian Holocaust. Just like how a lot of the kids never escaped, a lot of the kids never went home. Harriet Nahani of the Apache Nation on Vancouver Island went public about her experience in a press conference in Vancouver in 1995. She saw 14-year-old Maisie Shaw, a fellow student at the United Church Alberni Residential School, be kicked to her death by the principal, Alfred Caldwell, on Christmas Eve in 1946. This was one of the many deaths at residential schools that the government and churches covered up. Mass graves were dug at residential schools and Indian hospitals. Death rates in residential schools were fairly high. This was because of the torture and experiments they did on the children. This document shows the 50% death rate in Alberta's residential school. Children were also being experimented on and tortured in Indian hospitals. Indian hospitals opened in the 1930s, and the last one to close was in 1981. Many kids from residential schools were sent to Indian hospitals. Some of the kids were kidnapped and forced to go. It was a form of segregation. At one point, Canada had 29 Indian hospitals. Sharon Honock is an Indian hospital survivor, and she shares her story in a CBC article. She wasn't alone in having experiments done on her which resulted in health problems. Here are some of the testimonies from survivors. Children with tuberculosis were also made to attend class. Class action lawsuit has been filed against the Canadian government for conducting these experiments.
My strongest memory there is when the little girl died beside me. She must have been about 6. I was scared why the parents were not there. That's what I was scared about. And I knew they wouldn't feel comfortable for not being there when their daughter's dying.
And do you know why they weren't there?
They were never notified.
Indian children in the residential schools die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs.
The Federal Health Department admitted to using residential school children in experiments. There was also a number of forced sterilizations and forced abortions. To add to the silencing of Indigenous people's voices, they couldn't even take it to court because it was illegal for them to hire a lawyer. St. Anne's Indian Residential School operated from 1902 to 1976. A CBC article called "The Horrors of St. Anne's" goes through some of the abuse that these children experienced. St. Anne's had built their own electric chair and would torture kids with it. Kids were abused if they spoke their language, and sometimes needles were put into their tongues. There was also hardly any learning in these schools. Kids would reach a grade 5 level education by the time they were 18. The nuns would shame and mock girls for having their periods. Here are some quotes from Carly Robertson's Indigenous Women's Experiences of the Canadian Residential School System. They were exposed to a world where they were shamed for their periods, which is the opposite of Indigenous teachings of women and Two-Spirit people. Throughout Indigenous teachings, women and Two-Spirit people are seen as sacred and they are honored.
This is called the Women's Nomination Belt. So we had hundreds of treaties that were used to recognize and to remember our history. And this is just a very tiny bit of that oral history because I want to talk specifically, and it's directly related. And this was about the strength of women in our culture and the role of women in being leaders and being respected and honored for her role and her responsibilities in our culture. She chose leadership. She was a leader of her clan. She's a leader in her family. And everybody respected her. She's honored so much and respected so much.
Although all nations don't have a concept of Two-Spirit people, across those Indigenous nations that do, Two-Spirit people were historically held in high regard and often considered sacred or divine, holding important positions like matchmakers, medicine people, or warriors on the front lines of battle.
The Indian Act, residential school, and Indian hospitals affected and still do the mental, spiritual, emotional, and physical well-being of Indigenous people. When Indigenous women lost their status and were forced off the reserves, they were in unfamiliar and vulnerable spaces. The Indian Act was completely dismissive to those who identify as Two-Spirit and aimed to enforce heterosexual marriage by means of identifying who gains Indian status. As FamiliesLGBT.org says, the purpose of this legislation was to institutionalize the patrilineal descent and heterosexual marriage. They were enforcing European standards in where a woman is the extension of her husband and the husband has control over her rights. It created a separation that didn't exist before European contact. This perception and the separation between men and women continued throughout residential schools. New ideas and beliefs were negatively engraved in Indigenous women. They had an altered life perception and felt shame about their culture, bodies, desires, and appearances. Some survivors turned to addiction to try and cope with the horrible, traumatic memories of these experiences. It left them feeling worthless and detached from the knowledge, teachings, and values of their culture. Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people faced horrible accounts of intersectionality. Many survivors had unclear perceptions on love and horrible health problems due to all the experiments done on them. These events caused intergenerational trauma. Despite Canada's attempt to take away Indigenous people and their culture, Indigenous people are alive, resilient, strong, and working hard to preserve the knowledge and teachings of their culture. Charlotte Nolan is a Two-Spirit knowledge keeper who has created a program that is reintegrating Two-Spirit Indigenous people back into traditional ceremonies.
Saskatoon bushes, crab apples, horsetail. You have arthritis, that takes away a lot of that pain. And it grows here everywhere. Many of our relatives have been turned away from other sun dances and they haven't been made welcome. And we felt that we needed to do this. Our Two-Spirit children, they need a place to come to, and that's what the land's going to be for. We're going to do away with these patriarchal rules that people have put in place. There will be those that will disagree with the way we do our ceremonies, because at our Sundance, people will wear what they're comfortable wearing, whether it's a skirt or skirt, you know. People won't be segregated into male, female. We'll do it the way we are supposed to do it.
Some Indigenous women use social media to spread the knowledge and ways of their culture. Mallory at Tribal Trade is a YouTube channel where she shares all about Indigenous culture, wellness, and spirituality.
Are women with an extremely high standard and considered them to be highly sacred. But why? Why are women so special? This video will share exactly why Indigenous people of North America consider women to be so sacred and significant.
Ina Noalinga is an Inuk throat singer who shares her culture on social media. Sonia Boileau is from the Mohawk Nation and she is a filmmaker. One of the movies she directed is called Rustic Oracle.
Front lawn, Mother. Is that okay with you? Jesus Christ.
I'm waiting up for Heather.
Oh, that's my job, baby.
Mom. Have you seen my sister?
I interviewed my cousin Michelle Voyageur, who has broken the cycle of generational trauma.
Hi, my name is Michelle Voyageur. I live in Prince George, BC, and I am Natalie Lowe's second cousin, but I like to think of her as my niece. I'm 61, and I am from the band, the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, which is located in Fort Chipewyan, northeastern Alberta. And one of the things people ask me is about my mom, who's the sweetest little 85-year-old white woman you ever want to know. I was a part of the 60 Scoop, and I didn't realize that until just, fairly recently. And my birth mother was sent away from her community. I believe it was before anyone knew she was pregnant. Sent to Edmonton, where she waited until I was born, and then she signed off, surrendered me at birth, and walked away. And then coincidentally, my foster mom, who I call Mom, so she had made inquiries about becoming a foster parent. A neighbor had told her about an organization, and they put her in touch with me, because they said, well, we have a brand new baby if you want her. And she's like, oh, okay. So I went to live with my mom and my dad, who's my foster father. And I'm one of the lucky ones, because although I wasn't raised in my community, my birth community, I was raised in a loving home, and I'm still with the same mom. I was never shuffled around. And I realize how fortunate that is, because I have 8 half-siblings from our birth mother, and every one of them had been in foster care at some point in their lives, whether it was due to, like, some of them did live with our birth mother, her alcoholism, and then at one point some of them were shifted over to my maternal grandmother, who back in the day, she was also an alcoholic. So my poor siblings, they were just shuffled around all over the place. And none of them really formed that bond between a mother and a child. So I'm just so fortunate that that's how my life has gone.
60 Scoop began in 1951 when amendments to the Indian Act gave the province's jurisdiction over Indigenous child welfare, where none existed federally. Social workers took Indigenous children from their families and communities without consent. It is estimated around 20,000 Indigenous children or more were taken in the 60 Scoop. A lot of kids were shuffled around in different foster homes. Some never saw their birth parents ever again. Many were left with a lost sense of cultural identity.
This is a special adoption program. The provincial government feels that this program is essential. For the past 5 years, the number of children in care of the Department of Welfare has been increasing by approximately 180 a year. This trend is causing us real concern. While we have had reasonable success in placing white children for adoption, we have had great difficulty in placing Indian and Métis children.
The Indigenous Foundation says the 60 Scoop occurred not because the government was genuinely concerned for the well-being of Indigenous children, but primarily as an extension of the racist policies against Indigenous communities meant to assimilate Indigenous children into Western society and strip them from their culture and communities.
In light of all the things that have been going on, for decades, that are only in recent years started to come to light, I think that it's affected my community where I live now, which is in Prince George, BC, in that there are more rallies, more conferences. In fact, we just had a conference for 3 days last week, and it was to deal with addiction, counseling. And so it's opened our eyes to what Indigenous people have been having to deal with. And I think in time it's going to get a little bit better as far as like the treatment. We need that, the treatment from drug addiction to alcoholism. And it has been featured more in the media, I've noticed, on the news, different news outlets that I follow on Facebook. And I would like to think it's very enlightening to the general public that weren't aware of these things. Case in point, when the children were found in Kamloops, the 215, it was it broke early in the morning on the news, and I was out at a thrift store with one of my daughters, and as I was approaching the front door, this woman who I thought, does she know me? Because she just walked right up to me like she knew who I was. And she introduced herself, and she was almost tearful, and she was white, and she just wanted to say to me that she was sorry. She was sorry for what had happened. And because it affected her so much, she was so upset that morning. And she just wanted to apologize to the first Indigenous person that she came across that day, and that was me. And then I told her, thank you, I appreciate your concern, thank you. And I don't know, I can't count how many times she apologized, and I'm just so sorry, I'm so sorry. And then it hit me about 20 minutes later how I just broke down and cried. I thought, oh my God, she's coming to me to tell me this, and it was an honor. I felt honored that she would do that. So there's an example of the media getting involved, and it should have been like that years and years ago.
Investigators in Canada say that they have found 751 unmarked graves at the site of a former school for Indigenous children.
The discovery was made in Saskatchewan at the Cowessess First Nation. This comes after last month's discovery of 215 graves at another school for Indigenous people in British Columbia. From the 19th century to the 1970s, more than 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their homes and then forced to attend state-funded Christian schools.
The Canadian government has admitted that physical and sexual abuse was rampant at these schools.
Truth and Reconciliation spent 6 years traveling to all parts of Canada and heard from more than 6,500 witnesses. TRC also hosted 7 national events across Canada to engage the Canadian public, educate people about the history and legacy of residential school system, and share and honor the experiences of former students and their families. TRC made 94 recommendations to further reconciliation between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. TRC's estimated number of unmarked graves is 3,200.
Anyways, as far as the teachings in schools and whatnot of the plight that we are facing as Indigenous people, I know for a fact my granddaughter, who's in high school, grade 8, she had a whole class teaching about Indigenous people, their ways. They have drummers come in once a week. She has assignments to do, and she is more aware of things like that. And I think that's the best way, is teach them while they're young, and so they'll be able to see what it's like out there in the real world. So yes, we live at an intersection of highways. One is Highway 16 east and west, and the other is Highway 97 north and south. So at the beginning of our highway is heading west on Highway 16, and that is the Highway of Tears. It's about 800 miles. Don't ask me kilometers, I never learned that. And it was always a given that, you know, oh, I need a ride. Oh, nobody can give me a ride. Well, I'm going to go hitchhike. And I hitchhiked when I was probably 18 or 19. And you never gave it a second thought. It was just, you needed a ride. Somebody offered to pick you up. Sure, let's go. Just knowing all the missing and murdered Indigenous women along that strip of highway, it's overwhelming.
The Highway of Tears lacks transportation, and there is no exact number of the women who have gone missing and murdered on the Highway of Tears. The estimated number is over 40 women. There has been no new cases after 2006, but women still get abused on the highway. On December 23, 2022, CBC posted an article called Indigenous Woman Recounts Incident of Racist Threats on Remote Stretch of BC Highway. Rhonda Ned, a Syilx woman, recounts the incident where she was threatened. Little is being done to ensure safety along the Highway of Tears.
It's like it just gets swept under the rug. They don't investigate. They kind of go, oh yeah, we'll look into it. It's like, no, you won't. You know, it's like you don't care. It's like we're a community where it's like we're invisible, you know. And if you ignore it long enough, it'll go away. And that's not so. You know, these families are missing their family members, and I just don't understand how it's gotten as bad as it has. So every year there's at least one section of the highway where there's a group of people, a band, like, where they will all gather, they'll have a little ceremony, and then they'll walk X amount of miles of that highway with signs and everything, to keep it in, you know, so that people will see it up front, because it's usually on the news, and it's just something to raise awareness, and I think that's great. I've driven past them before, you know, and they're amazing. Some of them, the clothes they are wearing is just, it's hard to explain what it feels like to drive past them when you know what they're driving there or what they're walking for. And I think that's something that all communities should be aware of, and you know, try to attend, you know, show your support, and bring your children. You know, they need to see this too, because this is their world.
May 5th is Red Dress Day, a national day of awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. Inspired by the Métis artist Jamie Black's Red Dress Project installation.
Red dresses to mark the absence of missing and murdered Indigenous women across Canada. What I do is I've been traveling around putting up the empty red dresses and art installations in order to get people thinking and talking about the issue, and also getting communities all across Canada, you know, to kind of start becoming more cohesive and understanding from both sides what's happening, and just build solidarity and action around the issue.
Indigenous women and girls make up 4% of the total female population in Canada. 16% of all homicides are Indigenous women and girls in Canada. There have been many different films made on the effects of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. Rustic Oracle is one of those films about an Indigenous girl whose teen sister goes missing, and how that disappearance affects her small family and her entire community.
You cannot be here.
Is it her? Is it my daughter?
It's not her. It's not her. It's not Heather. Okay? You can't be here.
It's Sean!
No! No! What did he do with her? What did he do with her?
Calm down. Can't stay here.
This is the reality that many Indigenous families have to face. The RCMP reported 1,200 Indigenous women have gone missing in Canada from 1980 to 2012. However, a lot of Indigenous people estimate this number is closer to 4,000. The RCMP report does not include unexplained or suspicious deaths. Indigenous women and girls' deaths are not always fully properly investigated. As a result, some victims of a crime have been inaccurately identified as non-Indigenous, because police have not had proper training on why accurate identification is important and how it is to be determined. MediaSmart states that one of the reasons Indigenous women and girls are missing and murdered is because of the representation of them in the media. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls was officially launched on August 3, 2016. On June 3, 2019, the final report of the National Inquiry, entitled Reclaiming Power in Place, was released.
First, most important point about this final report is that we are here today at this juncture in time with this final report of the National Inquiry for one reason and one reason only, and that is the lost lives and the numbers of missing Indigenous women and girls in this country. Were it not for the strength, courage, and perseverance of their family members, their communities, their leaders, Indigenous women advocates, and all of our human rights allies, we would never have gotten this national inquiry or this important and extremely significant final report that we have now.
Through the National Inquiry, Canada was found guilty of genocide.
Earlier this morning, the National Inquiry formally presented their final report, in which they found that the tragic violence that Indigenous women and girls have experienced amounts to genocide.
The National Inquiry states that genocide has been empowered by colonial structures, evidenced notably by the Indian Act, the 60 Scoop, residential schools, and breaches of human and Indigenous rights, leading directly to the current increased rates of violence, death, and suicide in Indigenous populations. The National Inquiry stated that there are 4 pathways that need to be explored in order to end this genocide: historical, multi-generational, and intergenerational trauma, social and economic marginalization, maintaining the status quo and institutionalized lack of will, and ignoring the agency and expertise of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people. The National Inquiry contains 231 recommendations for them to get to the core of the issue.
Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls of Canada, to their families and to survivors, we have failed you. But we will fail you no longer.
Have I seen changes since the National Inquiry? If there are any, I haven't noticed. I mean, they're always talking. The government's always talking. This is what we should do. This is, oh, we're sorry. We're so sorry. But then do something. Like, put something into place that will help the Indigenous people that are affected by either residential schools or any number of things, addictions for one thing, and make what you're offering to help more accessible to people. Because I know a lot of people they don't know, or do they qualify, and how do I get into that? And oh, it costs money. Oh, I can't do that. So you need to make them so that it's accessible to all of them, no matter what their status in life is, whether they're working, not working, if they have a disability, how are they going to get there to their treatment, whether it's counseling or any kind of treatment, really. And yeah, it's the government really can do more than just say, oh, here, we'll give you some money, that'll make it way better. Don't throw money at a problem that you have no solution to, because that is not a solution.
If you were a part of the 60 Scoop, you were eligible to apply for a settlement from the government. In Kevin D. Annette's book, Hidden No Longer, Genocide in Canada Past and Present, he discusses the compensation point system for survivors of residential schools. In an alternative dispute resolution process, the abuse you experienced was translated into points, which was then translated into money.
It says learning about my own culture, history, and background, and what that has been like. Okay, so obviously I had no teachings. I had nothing to do with my culture until my birth father found me at the age of 42. And I had him in my life for 14 years before he passed away. But because his community is way, way out there in the middle of nowhere, it's only accessible by plane. It's accessible by the winter road for only like a few months of the year when the ice is thick enough to drive over it. And it's such an expense to get there, because you have to obviously fly, and even to go from Fort McMurray and in this teeniest little plane, you can't even stand up in it, and to go to Fort Chipewyan, the cost is astronomical. I would love to have had them be closer to us so that we could visit more often. Like, I've been there 3 times. And it's just not long enough. I mean, the last time I was there was for my father's funeral. And we were there for 2 weeks. And even then, it's just, there's so much information there. They have a wonderful museum showing our history. There's pictures of my paternal grandfather. There's pictures of, like, my dad in there, and family members, and the history of the Voyageurs in Fort Chipewyan. I mean, there's a lot of them. And at one point we were discussing cousins when we went to his funeral, and somebody said, well, we lost count, but we got up to about 300. And those are cousins. Like, blew us away. We're like, what? But I would love to be able to learn more about our culture and their ways. Like, I've heard stories of a great-great-grandmother who was a very powerful medicine woman. And, I mean, the one story I heard about her was that there was somebody who was gravely ill, near death, and she concocted some potion, and anyway, the person took it, and they got better. They live. And it's funny because my oldest daughter started to make her own potions when she was about 7 or 8, and she still does that to this day. So I'm thinking, yeah, that's kind of our history trickling down, through the generations, and that's her thing. She loves creating stuff like that. Anything else I would like to talk about or point out or touch base on? I myself experienced something that I would never want any child to experience. I was raised, like I said, in a white family. And so all of my friends in school were white, which I didn't even think that was strange or not. And I thought, okay, that's cool. And then I started to hang out with the wrong crowd and ended up in a situation. I was raped. I was gang raped at the age of 14 by 6 white guys. Now, when you think about it, it's like, wow, that's horrible. How can that happen? And, oh, they probably got jail time. When the police came to question me with my parents sitting there, they all of a sudden sort of sent me out of the room, and I thought, what's going on? And the next thing you know, I heard the door shut. I'm like, what's happening? Why can't I tell my side of the story? It's because the police told my parents, well, she was hanging out with them. She had been drinking the night before with them. So, yeah, they're just going to drag her name through the mud. Let's just leave it alone. Like, don't even bother. And so nothing happened. Nothing came of that. And that was when I realized there is seriously something wrong with this system. And yeah, that affected my life in a negative way for several years. But my mindset was, no, that's not going to control my life. That's not going to control who I am and who I will become. And, now I'm the proud mother of 3 beautiful daughters. They're all so successful in their own ways. I have 3 grandchildren, and they make me so proud. And you probably hear the youngest one in the background. She's very vocal. And yeah, so I don't know. Life is what you make it. The help is there for the asking. And always, like I said, keep an open mind, an open ear, and an open heart. And you can change somebody's life. You can help. Be informed. Learn things. Listen and watch the news and see what's happening with the government with helping Indigenous people. I mean, I know, like I said, it's a slow thing, and the money, it's like, why would you want to give me money because you found a bunch of children's bodies? How's that going to make me feel better? The history with that in the Catholic Church is just mind-boggling. I don't know. And the funny thing is, I did go to Catholic school myself, grades 1 through 6. I was taught by nuns. It was weird when I went to a public school in grade 7 and all of a sudden I had a male teacher. I was like, whoa, that's not right.
The government and law enforcement are still working against Indigenous women. Article on the Globe and Mail, Senator Murray Sinclair talks about how truth and reconciliation could improve. Also in Kevin D. Annette's independent inquiry, he states that TRC is Canada's final cover-up and indemnification.
My daughter was stabbed multiple times in the stomach. Guy bit off her ear, gave her a hairline fracture. They had to do a life-saving emergency and put her on life support. Was there justice for her? No. The guy got off scot-free. He didn't get charged for anything. When you talk about the roots of what our Indigenous women deal with, that's our reality.
Was very compassionate, intelligent,
As she remembers the wonderful woman she was, Natasha Harrison is once again pleading to the public for information on what happened to her 20-year-old daughter, Tatiana. She says her remains were found on a yacht in Richmond on May 2nd. After she spent months desperately searching for her, police didn't confirm those remains were hers until August.
I was searching for my daughter's body. I'm screaming to people like something's happened, and it's getting dismissed.
And it's more of a nightmare than a dream.
She's among 5 other women speaking out about the cases of their lost loved ones, including Chelsea Poorman, a 24-year-old whose body laid in a Vancouver mansion for more than a year, yet her death wasn't considered suspicious. Noelle Ellie Osoup, a 14-year-old child whose decomposing remains went undetected by authorities for months after she vanished while in ministry care. And Ramona Wilson, a 16-year-old who was last seen in Smithers, northern BC in 1994. Her case remains unsolved.
We have been trying to find answers in what happened to her, who did this to her, who murdered her.
No one deserves to be treated as though their missing loved one was not important or didn't matter.
The stories are all unique, but their experiences with law enforcement are similar, and so is the demographic of each victim. All Indigenous women whose cases are fraught with what their relatives say is negligence, a lack of accountability, and discrimination.
An article on realpeoples.media by Anton Beckert called "Indigenous Women Are Still Being Murdered in Vancouver." They explore these cases and the neglect upon them. And also a case from 2007 where a serial killer from Port Coquitlam was arrested. He said he had killed 49 women. Many of his victims were Indigenous women. For years, the police had looked the other way. Even after he was found guilty, the RCMP continued to look the other way. In 2020, the RCMP wanted to dispose of evidence on this case. When Indigenous women go missing and murdered, oftentimes the police say it's unsuspicious and hardly do any investigation. Vancouver Police Department explained their lack of response to the systemic murders by claiming that many street-involved women do not have close family ties and many deliberately go missing for any number of reasons, including their desires to evade the police. However, as scholar John Lohman points out, many did have close family ties and well-established social networks and had suddenly disappeared nonetheless. A lot of Indigenous families and communities find themselves looking for their loved ones who went missing, because the majority of the time the law enforcement looks the other way and refuses to help. Drag the Red is a community volunteer organization in Manitoba.
Bernadette, you started Drag the Red. Can you tell me why you started?
Well, there was a 15-year-old girl pulled out of the river, discarded in a garbage bag like she was garbage, and we were really hoping that the police would have dragged the red, so we had put it on social media. I had put it on social media that, you know, the red needs to be dragged. It was a record last year, like 7 bodies were pulled out of this river, so 4 while we were dragging in 2 months and the other 3 while we weren't dragging.
Drag the Red has not found any human remains, but think they may be loosening debris and causing bodies to float to the surface later.
There were times where the draggers were dragging and they fully felt like they had snagged on a body but couldn't pull it up, and the next day a body was recovered. So
why did police say that they're not going to help you search?
Well, they say they need evidence to search. Some of the things we've brought in are remains. We didn't know if they were human or not. Many articles of clothing that had blood stains on them. We've pulled stuff up from the river that were held down by cinder blocks. These guys this year pulled out a shotgun. So we make sure we document it and then we hand it over to the police. They have boats. We don't have that many boats. We weren't asking them to come out and die, but we were asking is if they would come out and accompany us dragging. We don't want to put anybody's life at risk. Definitely not. We know that our water is murky, muddy, zero visibility.
So what are you guys hoping to do today? What's the plan?
Just drag and just do our best to try to find some evidence. If we can, we can. If we can't, then we'll just come another day. Just let it go down. And you'll know when it hits the bottom, when it stops moving. Bottom, right? So then you go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you just wait.
So all we're doing is drifting with the current right now, right? Wow. Do you find it a problem that civilians are doing what could be considered police work?
No, I don't, because we wouldn't be doing it in the first place. If they feel comfort and solace in doing it to bring closure to themselves and anybody else, then all the power to them, and we support that as a police service.
You support it morally, but not with resources?
Correct. It's just not a good allocation of our resources.
Is there any point in searching at all?
In our estimation, no.
So why don't police want you doing this? Have you asked them for help?
Yeah.
And what do they say?
We won't do it. It's risk over reward.
What does that mean?
I don't know. I really don't know. Like, you're doing it right now, they're risking their lives, and who knows, and maybe there's not even a reward there, maybe. But if they knew there was somebody there, maybe then they would do it. Because then it's more of a... So I don't know.
Because they need evidence to be able to go after it, right?
Well, yeah, they need evidence, but to me, it's just common sense, Everybody would, in my eyes, you want to get rid of something, you throw it in here.
Police also wouldn't search the Winnipeg landfill where there were 2 Indigenous women's bodies, and there was another body suspected in the landfill.
Indigenous women, Morgan Harris and Mercedes Myron.
I should not have to come here and be so mad and beg so that you will find and bring our loved ones home.
Whose families, including Morgan Harris's daughter, along with some Indigenous leaders, traveled to Ottawa to insist the bodies be recovered.
Police won't do anything, and they say that they can't search because it's not feasible. Is human life not feasible?
After media pressure, the government committed $500,000 to search the landfill. The Canadian government continues to make broken promises to Indigenous people. 73% of the First Peoples water systems are at high or medium risk of contamination.
For Indigenous people, water is life and needs to be respected. Indigenous women share a sacred connection to water through their role as child bearers and givers of life. Indigenous women have long had their responsibility of protecting and nurturing water and its sacred nature, as well as playing a role in governance related to water. This has continued today as Indigenous women raise their voices in response to political and social water issues facing Indigenous people and seek to reestablish their connection to water and the role that they play in protecting it.
Autumn Peltier is a clean water activist.
Autumn Peltier, I come from the Unclean unceded territory, and I'm Indigenous. I met Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for the first time in 2016, I'm pretty sure. I just told him about the water issue and what I want to be done and the water crisis and for the First Nations communities that can't drink their water.
On March 11, 2022, Autumn Peltier posted this video to Instagram with the following caption. Yeah! Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people still face a lot of discrimination in Canada.
what could everyone do in support to be an ally, advocate, supporter to Indigenous women and girls? The best thing is to talk about it. Keep it in the forefront. Keep it so that people will want to come and ask questions and look for answers. Just be present. Just listen. Even if you just see someone and they're in distress and you know something's going on, like that happened to my youngest daughter. She came across this woman. She was Indigenous, and she was just standing on the side of the road near the shopping mall, just sobbing. And it just took my daughter to walk up and say, "Hey, are you okay? Is there anything I can do? Can I drive you somewhere? Do you need help?" And she just was overwhelmed by life in general and the things she was facing. And my daughter just listened to her, and that was all it took. She listened to her, and then she gave her a hug. And the girl's like, "Oh, I don't know what I've done. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come by when you did," because she was that low. Like it scares me to think of what she could have done to herself had my daughter not been there at that moment. So next steps would be, more rallies. When I saw the one that took place in Vancouver several weeks back, my heart was racing. I started to cry, and I was like, why am I crying right now? But it's that there were so many people that wanted to be a part of that, and to hear the people that were talking about the tragedies they've gone through, about, okay, I'm, X amount of months or years clean now, and just knowing that gives me strength to know that there's hope. And that's something I think that people really don't think about, oh, somebody's going to go get treatment. Ooh, yeah, they're going to be back in the bar in, a couple of days. And for someone to keep their clean, healthy living going that's amazing to me. And I think it's just knowing that what my family is like as far as the background that gives me strength. Is most of my Voyageur family, we're so fortunate. We come from a great band, and that's there for educational purposes and whatnot. And I have my one cousin. She was the first Indigenous woman to graduate with her doctorate from the University of Alberta. And most of my cousins, all of them highly educated, with degrees and whatnot, and they have amazing jobs. So, these are all things that are possible for Indigenous people. It's just, you have to get there. You have to keep going, do what you can to get a higher education, and to learn what services are available through your band. There's so many things that they can do, like I said, as far as education, helping with families, counseling. It's all there. It's there for the asking, and I know it's hard for people to feel like if they ask for help, that means they're helpless, and it means no. Asking for help is the strongest thing that a person can do for themselves. And I think if more people realize that, it will very, very slowly start to change. And that's what we want, is change. I think that's important. Just have an open ear, an open heart. And you don't have to dole out advice, because I know a lot of people aren't very up on their information in regard to this. And just read and look into it, and go onto your computer or your phone and Google it and see. YouTube has amazing videos about the Indigenous problems, and I thank you for having me be a participant in your project. It's an honor. And I'm going to sign off for now. So thank you.
There are different steps across Canada being taken to further reconciliation with Indigenous people. Indigenous language and culture is being taught to the youth across Canada.
You and honor you for coming into this world. You are a blessing to us. We're so very honored to have you as part of us. Nihio Skog. Always remember to hold your head up. Don't be ashamed, and always accept yourself for who you are and honor those gifts you brought with you. And welcome into womanhood. Welcome. It truly is a blessing and an honor to have you as a young Nihio Isko, young Nihio woman. Okay, welcome.
In a documentary titled The 60 Scoop, There's a Truth to Be Told, it showcases the different ways the Splatching First Nation is teaching the youth their culture.
We're a family with everything around us. It's all about reconnecting, and that interconnectedness is taught. You know, the concept of kasaltan, when we say kohaitis, kasaltan, all our relations, we're related to everything, not just the two-legged, the four-legged, the winged ones, all of creation. That's our teaching, and that's what we're trying to bring back with what we're doing, because that's one of our foundational laws, and it is about family.
One of the ways they taught their history was through a community play.
Well, I think Tweedimus is giving people in the community an opportunity to share time together, and share time together in a really positive sense.
A healing village for Indigenous women is underway in Manitoba. Its estimated completion is fall/winter of 2023 to 24.
Solving systemic and generational trauma in Indigenous communities.
We need to do things right. We need to do things differently, and we need to follow our traditional ways to do it.
Billy Shibler from the Clan Mothers Elder Council says the healing village will combine a traditional Indigenous matrilineal land-based model of healing with the teaching of skills to help prepare the women for life beyond the village. There is no set amount of time a person is allowed to stay in the village while recovering, says Shibler, adding women with children are welcome to bring their kids with them.
And the clan mothers know that when we help a woman heal, we're helping her family heal.
Rochelle Squires says the village site will help grow communities for people who had their communities taken from them.
The trauma of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the loss of children at residential schools is devastating, and its impacts are long-lasting. As Manitobans and Canadians, we have a collective responsibility to acknowledge our country's hard truths.
Heather Stephenson, Manitoba's premier, says she is happy to be partnering with Clan Mothers in support of this Indigenous-led initiative, providing a culturally safe space for at-risk women to heal. The province says the land for the village has been donated as a gift by the Catholic Corporation as part of their commitment to reconciliation efforts. Shibler says the elders and grandmothers who will be providing treatment will draw upon their lived experience to provide culturally relevant healing through ceremony.
These are people who have lived experience in the violence, in exploitation, in all of the things that have affected our women out there, and our trans and our two-spirit out there.
The first phase of the project has already started with site inspections and land surveys, including the building of ceremonial structures. The second phase is expected to be underway next spring. In Winnipeg, Mark Neufeld, City News.
APTN is the first national Indigenous broadcaster in the world. They report on news surrounding Indigenous people and culture. They inspired children while honoring the wisdom of their elders.
We're from downtown Ottawa. It's in Gatineau, Quebec. Its 5 floors are adorned with Indigenous artwork from all over the world. Various rooms are dedicated to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit culture. There's also a gift shop and a kitchen. NWAC CEO Lynn Grew says the organization spent about $9 million on the new digs. She says this cost is going to be offset by revenue-generating opportunities.
So it's a holistic space that we have, which is our own office space, but as well as a revenue generation throughout the building. So we have a beautiful coffee shop, we have a store, an artisan store, we have workshop space, and we have space that is designed for meeting and for renting to other stakeholders, like other partners from the Government of Canada or private stakeholders as well.
As of September 2022, there were 16 healing forests across Canada. An Indigenous healing garden was installed at Alberta's Children's Hospital.
The planting ceremony, which took place Thursday. The garden was planted by Foodscape Calgary, an Indigenous-led social enterprise offering edible and sustainable landscape design. A garden of great significance.
It is the 4 colors of Mother Earth, which are also the 4 colors of mankind. And in time, through our teachings, I'm a Cree Métis woman, we knew that these colors would come together. We knew that one day we would actually be here, learning from each other and doing things together.
Another one of these gardens is in Atlantic Canada.
Dedicated to Sheila Glode of the Millbrook First Nation, a dialysis patient who died in 2013. The garden honors other community members who have died from kidney disease. It features traditional Indigenous symbols and plants used in ceremony. There's artwork designed by Mi'kmaq artists and an educational space to learn more about traditional Indigenous healthcare. Chief Bob Glode of the Millbrook First Nation says the park builds a path towards reconciliation.
The British Columbia government has officially recognized Two-Spirit Day as March 20th.
They were hosting an event to share some of the Two-Spirit work that's been going on in the province of BC and across Turtle Island for the last year, as well as celebrate Two-Spirit folks and bring awareness to all of our allies and relatives about Two-Spirit people.
Hi, how are you feeling today, knowing that today's such a big day?
I mean, I think today it's really important to recognize and acknowledge a lot of the trailblazers that have broken trail for us to be here today. So it's just really about centering, highlighting, and elevating our Two-Spirit ancestors, our elders and knowledge keepers.
On IndigenousWatchdog.org, they show the progress of Truth and Reconciliation, which has completed and started majority of its calls to justice. They also give 85 examples of reconciliation in action. Here are just a few of those. Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people are on their own journeys to truth and reconciliation.